There is a video on the internet that has been watched over 50 million times. It is not a movie trailer. It is not a music video. It is not something designed to entertain you. It is a 4-minute security camera recording from the elevator of a hotel in downtown Los Angeles, filmed on the night of February 1st, 2013. And if you have never seen it, if you are coming to this story completely fresh, I want you to understand something before I describe what is in that footage. I want you to understand that the woman in that video was 21 years old, that she was someone's daughter, that she had a blog where she wrote about her fears and her dreams and her struggle to find her place in the world the way that young people do, that she called her parents every single day of her trip to let them know she was safe, and that after the night this video was filmed, she never called again. Her name was Elisa Lam. And what happened to her inside the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles in the winter of 2013 is one of the most haunting, most debated, most genuinely unsettling cases in the history of modern true crime. Not because the answer was dramatic, but because the answer, even the official one, even the one backed by forensic evidence and coroner reports and police investigations, still leaves you sitting in the dark with questions that will not go away. And before this video is over, we are going to go through every single one of them. The hotel, the girl, the elevator, the water tank, the theories, the truth, and the parts of this story that nobody, not the police, not the coroner, not the Netflix documentary, not the 50 million people who watched the footage, has ever been able to fully explain. We begin not in Los Angeles. We begin in Vancouver. Elisa Lam was born on April 30th, 1991, in Vancouver, British Columbia. Her parents, David and Yina Lam, had emigrated from Hong Kong, the way so many families did, looking for something steadier, something safer, something that would give their children the kind of life that felt possible in a way it hadn't before. They opened a restaurant in Burnaby. They built a life. And Elisa, their daughter, their child who grew up between two cultures and found her own voice somewhere in the middle, was by every outward account a bright, curious, creative young woman. She studied at the University of British Columbia. She kept a blog, first on Blogspot, then on Tumblr, where she wrote about books, about travel, about the films she loved and the places she wanted to go. She wrote about her mental health, too, with a frankness that was unusual for someone her age. She wrote about her bipolar disorder, about the days when the darkness came in and she could not push it back, about the medication that helped and the times she stopped taking it and what happened when she did. She wrote about hiding under her bed, about once being hospitalized, about the fear of wasting her life. She was not hiding who she was. She was a young woman trying to understand herself in public with the kind of raw honesty that makes her blog achingly difficult to read now that we know how the story ends. In January 2013, Elisa decided to take a trip, a solo trip, down the west coast of America, by train, by bus, through cities she had never seen. San Diego first, then Los Angeles, then Santa Cruz. A journey of photographs and bookstores and new experiences, and the particular feeling of being young and alone in the world in a way that feels like freedom rather than danger. Her family was not entirely comfortable with her traveling alone. She had been struggling. She had not been registered for classes at the start of 2013. There were concerns about her mental state, about whether she was stable, about whether a solo trip was the right thing for her right now. But Elisa was determined, and she made a promise to her parents, one that, for anyone who has ever had a parent worry about them from a distance, is both completely ordinary and heartbreaking in hindsight. She promised to call them every single day, to check in, to let them know she was safe, and she kept that promise. Every day of her trip, from San Diego, from the road, from Los Angeles, Elisa Lam called her parents, until the day she didn't. On January 26, 2013, Elisa arrived in Los Angeles by Amtrak from San Diego and checked into the Cecil Hotel. or rather, into what the Cecil Hotel had rebranded itself as, in an attempt to distance itself from a history so dark and so densely packed with violence that it had become almost mythological. They called it Stay on Main. But everyone who knew anything about downtown Los Angeles knew exactly what building it was. The Cecil Hotel. 19 floors, 700 rooms, located on Main Street in one of the most difficult neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Skid Row, where homelessness and poverty and addiction had carved out a world that existed in the shadow of the city everyone else saw. The Cecil had opened in 1927 as a fashionable hotel for business travelers with a marble lobby and stained glass windows and the ambition of permanence. The Great Depression had arrived and never fully left. By the mid-20th century, it had descended into a single-room occupancy hotel, cheap rooms, transient guests, the kind of place where people stayed when they had nowhere else to go. And over the decades, the darkness that accumulated inside its walls became something that defied easy explanation. The Cecil Hotel had been the site of multiple suicides, guests who jumped from its windows onto the pavement below, enough of them that the hotel had installed window guards to slow the rate of deaths. It had been the temporary home of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, one of the most prolific serial killers in California history, who lived on the 14th floor in the 1980s and reportedly came home each night with blood on his clothes. Jack Unterweger, an Austrian serial killer who was himself obsessed with Ramirez, had stayed at the Cecil while murdering 3 women in Los Angeles in 1991. There were unsolved murders, disappearances, a woman found in the alley, a body in a stairwell. The hotel had absorbed so much violence over so many decades that by the time Elisa Lam checked in with her backpack and her travel plans in January 2003, the building itself had become a character in a story it kept writing. And she had no idea. Elisa checked in and was initially placed in a shared room on the 5th floor with other young women travelers. Within 2 days, her roommates complained about her behavior. The hotel's lawyer would later describe it as certain odd behavior, a phrase that covers a great deal of ground without specifying anything. The hotel manager, Amy Price, was more specific. She said Elisa had been leaving notes on her roommates' beds. Notes that said, "Go home." Notes that said, "Go away." She had been locking the room door and requiring a password for entry. She had been, in the understated language of hotel management, disrupting the other guests. Elisa was moved to a private room. The roommates who had complained never knew what they had been sharing space with. Not danger, not malice, but a young woman whose mind was beginning to fracture in ways that neither she nor anyone around her fully understood. On January 29th, 3 days after checking in, Elisa attended a live taping of the Conan O'Brien show in Burbank. She was escorted out by security. The reason given was disruptive behavior. She was becoming someone her parents would not have recognized over the phone. But she was still calling. Every day, letting them know she was safe. On January 31st, 2013, the day she was scheduled to check out of the Cecil and move on to Santa Cruz, Elisa Lam disappeared. Her parents did not hear from her that day. Not a call, not a text, nothing. For a woman who had called home every single day without exception, the silence was immediately alarming. Her parents contacted the Los Angeles Police Department. The LAPD went to the Cecil. They searched. They found her room. In disarray, her belongings inside. Her wallet, her laptop, her ID, her medication. Everything she would have needed to function in the world was still in that room. Elisa was not. Late-night employees had seen her in an area of the hotel not open to guests. Beyond that, nothing. No cameras on her floor, no footage of her leaving the building, no trace. The LAPD issued a missing persons bulletin. They described her, 21 years old, Chinese-Canadian, red hoodie, possibly suffering from mild depression, last seen at the Cecil Hotel, had been headed to Santa Cruz. If anyone had seen her, please call. Nobody called. And then February 13th arrived. And the LAPD did something that changed everything. They released the elevator footage. The video is 2.5 minutes long in its original form. Later versions released online run slightly longer. It is filmed from the security camera mounted in the corner of one of the Cecil Hotel's elevators, looking down at the floor buttons and the space inside the car. The footage begins with Elisa already inside the elevator. She is wearing a red hoodie, dark shorts, and has long, dark hair. She presses buttons, multiple buttons, a lot of them, more than any person normally presses when they know where they are going. Then she steps back toward the corner of the elevator. And then she moves to the elevator door, and she begins to look out. Not casually, not the way you look out of an elevator when you are checking if your floor has arrived. She moves close to the door frame and peers out carefully, leaning just her head and then her body out, looking down the hallway in one direction and then the other. And then she pulls back inside, and she does it again. And the elevator door does not close. The elevator door stays open, and Elisa moves in and out of the frame, sometimes inside the car, sometimes in the hallway, as though she is responding to something or someone that the camera cannot see. At one point, she presses herself back against the wall of the elevator. At another, she steps fully into the hallway and appears to speak, moving her mouth, gesturing with her hands in a way that looks like she is talking to someone just off frame. Her hands move in patterns that people who watched the video would spend years analyzing. Fluid, strange, deliberate patterns, like someone conducting music that only she could hear. And then she walks away down the hallway, out of frame. And the elevator door, finally, begins to close. And she never comes back. The internet received that footage like a stone thrown into still water. The ripples went out in every direction simultaneously and never fully stopped. By the time the video had been watched 10 million times, 20 million times, 50 million times, it had become a kind of cultural phenomenon, a 4-minute window into something that no one could agree on. Was she hiding from someone? Was she playing a game? Was she on drugs? Was she experiencing a psychotic episode? Was the footage edited? Was there someone holding the elevator door open from outside the frame? Was the hand gesturing a form of communication with a person, with something else? Theories proliferated with the particular velocity of the early internet, where every detail was a thread that someone somewhere was going to pull. The elevator button behavior, the door that would not close, the hands, the red hoodie. Someone noticed that in the Japanese horror film Dark Water, a girl in a red jacket falls into a water tank. Someone else noticed that a tuberculosis test being conducted near the Cecil at that exact time was called Lam Elisa. Someone found a death metal musician on YouTube who had filmed a video at the Cecil days before Elisa disappeared, and whose band was called Dynasty of Darkness, and whose latest music video featured a girl being chased to her death. The internet decided he was the killer. They sent him death threats. They had his YouTube channel, his email account, and his Facebook deactivated. And then it emerged through a verifiable passport trail that he had been in Mexico the entire time Elisa was at the Cecil Hotel. He had nothing to do with her death. He was an innocent person whose life was nearly destroyed by people who mistook coincidence for evidence and passion for justice. This is what the Elisa Lam case did to the people at its edges. It swallowed them. The hunger for an explanation. The insistence that something this strange had to have a sinister answer had to involve conspiracy. Had to be the product of human malice rather than something far less satisfying, caused real damage to real people in the pursuit of a narrative that felt worthy of the footage. And while the internet was building its theories, the guests at the Cecil Hotel were brushing their teeth, washing their faces, making coffee with the tap water, drinking glasses of it at night before bed. For 18 days after Elisa Lam disappeared, guests at the Cecil began to notice things about the water: low pressure, a strange taste, a discoloration that some described as brownish, that others described as simply wrong. They complained to the front desk. The front desk sent someone to investigate. On February 19, 2013, a maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez climbed a 10-foot ladder attached to the side of one of the 4 large water tanks on the Cecil Hotel's roof. He moved the hatch, he looked inside, and he saw Elisa Lam, naked, floating face up in the water, her clothing and her room key and her watch floating beside her, 12 inches from the surface. She had been there for 18 days. And the entire hotel had been drinking the water she was in. The discovery sent a wave of revulsion through the building and through the city and through the story. Guests who had been at the Cecil during those 18 days had to reckon with what they had been consuming. The mental health of multiple hotel employees was affected by what they had known and for how long and what it meant. The crime scene on the roof was processed carefully. Investigators noted that the roof was only accessible by an alarmed interior staircase door that required a key to disable, or by an exterior fire escape ladder. The alarm on the interior door had not been triggered. There were no signs of forced entry. No signs of a struggle. No signs that Elisa had been dragged to the roof or placed in the tank by anyone else. Her body showed no signs of physical trauma. No bruising, no defensive wounds, no evidence of sexual assault. The autopsy, performed on February 21st, was initially inconclusive. The coroner could not immediately determine the manner of death. Toxicology tests were ordered. The results took months. What they found, or rather, what they did not find, was significant. Elisa Lam's blood contained no alcohol, no illegal drugs. No recreational substances of any kind. What it did contain were her medications. The bipolar medication she had been prescribed, the ones her room had been found without, the ones she had apparently stopped taking at some point during her stay at the Cecil. The medications were present in her blood, but at levels that suggested she had not been taking them consistently. She had been prescribed bupropion, lamotrigine, quetiapine, dextroamphetamine, and venlafaxine. A complex medication regimen that her family had confirmed she sometimes stopped following, and that when she did, she experienced hallucinations. She hid under her bed. She was hospitalized at least once. She had episodes that frightened the people around her because she was frightened herself, genuinely, completely, terrifyingly unable to distinguish between what was real and what her mind was manufacturing. And investigators looking at the timeline of her behavior at the Cecil, the notes to the roommates, the ejection from Conan, the strange elevator footage, began to build a picture of a young woman in the middle of exactly one of those episodes. A young woman whose mind was telling her something that was not true, something that made her afraid, something that sent her, alone, in the middle of the night, to find somewhere to hide. In June 2013, 4 months after her body was discovered, the Los Angeles County coroner officially ruled Elisa Lam's death an accidental drowning, with bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing factor. The official conclusion, the one supported by the forensic evidence, by the toxicology, by the absence of trauma, by the structure of her documented mental health history, was this. Elisa Lam, in the grip of a bipolar episode made worse by inconsistent medication, had accessed the roof of the Cecil Hotel via the exterior fire escape ladder. She had climbed to the roof, she had found the water tank, and she had, in a state of hallucination or panic, or some combination of both that we will never be able to fully reconstruct, opened the hatch and climbed inside. Perhaps she was hiding. The homicide detective who worked the case said plainly that when Elisa went without medication, she hallucinated and hid. She hid under her bed, in closets, in enclosed spaces where she felt safer than the world outside. Perhaps the water tank was, in her mind, exactly that. A place of safety. A place where whatever she was running from could not find her. And once she was inside, the tank was 4 feet wide and 8 feet long and filled nearly to the top with water. She could not get back out. The ladder was on the outside. The hatch, which the maintenance worker would later insist was open when he found her, would have been above her reach once she was in the water. She undressed. possibly to stay afloat longer, possibly because the hypothermia that was already setting in was causing the paradoxical warmth sensation that causes drowning victims to remove clothing in freezing water. And then, alone in a dark tank on the roof of the Cecil Hotel, Elisa Lam drowned. And the world went on around her for 18 days without knowing. That is the official answer. And it is the answer that the forensic evidence supports. And it is the answer that, for many people, will never be enough. Because here is the thing about the Elisa Lam case that makes it genuinely different from other cases where the official conclusion is unsatisfying. The questions that remain are not the product of conspiracy thinking. They are structural. They live inside the official explanation itself, and they do not go away when you accept the conclusion. The roof door required a key to disable the alarm. Elisa did not have a key. If she used the exterior fire escape ladder, she had to have found it, climbed it, and accessed the roof without anyone seeing her. In a building with hundreds of rooms and a front desk staff, the water tank hatch required effort to open. The maintenance worker said it was open when he found her. An earlier LAPD statement said it was closed. Both cannot be true. If it was closed when she was found, how did it close? She was in the water. She could not have closed it from the inside. If it was open when she was found, why did the police originally say it was closed? These are not the questions of internet conspiracy theorists looking for shadows. These are questions that arise from the physical reality of the space and the official investigation, under pressure to close a case that had become a media obsession in a city that had other problems to manage, involving a building that everyone wished would stop making headlines, did not answer them cleanly. The LAPD themselves admitted years later that they had searched the roof during the initial investigation without checking inside the water tanks. They had brought a cadaver dog to the hotel. They had conducted a floor-by-floor search. And they had stood on the same roof where Elisa Lam's body was decomposing in a tank above their heads, and left without finding her. And then there is the elevator footage itself. Because the official explanation accounts for Elisa's mental state, her behavior, her eventual location. But it does not fully account for the elevator, the door that would not close. The technical explanation that the elevator had a timed hold function triggered by pressing multiple buttons, which Elisa had done, answers why the door stayed open mechanically. But it does not explain the quality of her behavior in that hallway. People who have studied bipolar episodes, who have worked with patients in states of acute psychosis, have said that the elevator footage is entirely consistent with a person experiencing a paranoid hallucination. The checking, the hiding, the gesturing, the way she moves in and out of the frame as though navigating a threat that only she can perceive. But people who have never experienced that, who watch the footage without that context, do not see a woman having a mental health crisis. They see something that looks like something else, something that looks like fear of a specific, external thing, something that looks like a woman responding to a presence. And the camera's field of view, and the angle, and the fact that the hallway outside was never captured on film means that we cannot prove there was no one there. We simply do not know. What we do know, and what the Elisa Lam case forces us to sit with, is the human cost of the hunger for a better story. Pablo Vergara, the death metal musician who happened to film a video at the Cecil, whose music happened to be dark, whose face happened to appear in search results when people typed Elisa Lam murder suspect, nearly died because of the internet's need for a villain. He was innocent. He was in Mexico. He had nothing to do with anything, but the machine of online obsession had already decided, and the damage was done before the truth could catch up. The documentary filmmaker Joe Berlinger, who made the Netflix series about the case in 2021, said it as directly as anyone has said it. The sensationalization of Elisa Lam's death, the gamification of her tragedy, the treatment of her final hours as a puzzle to be solved by strangers on Reddit was not justice. It was not even curiosity. It was a way of making entertainment out of a family's grief. And the Lam family. David and Yinna, the parents who had asked their daughter to call them every day, who had waited by the phone on January 31st and heard nothing, were living inside a story that the internet had decided belonged to everyone except them. In September 2013, Elisa's parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Cecil Hotel, arguing that the hotel had failed to properly secure its rooftop and water tanks, and that their negligence had contributed to their daughter's death. In 2015, a judge dismissed the suit, ruling that the hotel was not liable because Elisa's actions were not foreseeable, because no reasonable hotel management could have anticipated a guest accessing the roof and entering a water tank. Whether that ruling sat comfortably with anyone who heard it is another question. The Cecil Hotel itself went through its own long decline. The rebranding as Stay on Main had not worked. The Elisa Lam case had cemented the building's identity in a way that no amount of fresh paint could undo. The hotel closed in 2007 for renovation that never came. In 2021, the same year, the Netflix documentary aired and brought the story to a new generation. The building was reopened by the Skid Row Housing Trust as a 600-unit affordable housing complex for residents earning less than 30% of the area median income. The marble lobby and the stained glass windows that had once made it fashionable still stand inside. The water tanks on the roof were removed. The Cecil Hotel, the building, the history, the accumulated weight of every terrible thing that had ever happened within its walls, became, of all things, a place for people who needed housing. Whether that is justice or irony or simply the way that time moves through places, each person will have to decide for themselves. Elisa Lam was 21 years old. She would have turned 22 that April, 3 months after she disappeared. She had a blog full of her thoughts. Thoughts about the future, about what she wanted her life to mean, about the struggle of living inside a mind that did not always cooperate with the life she was trying to build. She wrote in one of her last posts before her trip about the fear of being forgotten, about wanting to matter, about wanting the people who came after her to feel something when they heard her name, and in the strangest, most painful way possible. She got that. 50 million people have watched her last known moments on a screen. Her name has been attached to films and television shows, and a 4-part Netflix documentary, and a video game, and 1,000 Reddit threads, and a tuberculosis test that bears her name by pure coincidence. More people know who Elisa Lam is than would have known if everything had gone the way it was supposed to go. If she had checked out on January 31st and caught the bus to Santa Cruz and taken her photographs and written her blog posts and grown older and built a life that looked like what she was hoping for. That is not comfort. That is not a silver lining. That is just the terrible math of a tragedy that became a cultural moment, which is something entirely different from a life. What I want you to take from this story, the thing that I think actually matters, beyond the theories and the footage and the questions that will never be cleanly answered, is this. Elisa Lam was not a mystery to be solved. She was not a puzzle. She was not a horror movie or an internet meme or a piece of evidence in someone's theory about what the Cecil Hotel really is. She was a person who was struggling, who was fighting every day to manage a mind that was working against her, who loved books and travel and writing and the particular freedom of being young enough to believe that everything is still possible, who called her parents every day of a trip that was supposed to be an adventure because she knew they worried, because she loved them, because that is the kind of person she was. And on the night she stopped calling, on the night the elevator footage was being recorded and nobody was there to help her, nobody was there to see that she needed help, the hotel went on around her, and the city went on outside the windows, and the world did not notice until the water turned dark. She deserved better. She deserved someone to notice sooner. She deserved to make it to Santa Cruz and to write about what the Pacific looked like from the beach and to call her parents that night and tell them she was fine. Her name was Elisa Lam. She was 21 years old, and she was not a mystery. She was a person, remember that?